The Storyteller's Handbook. This new and breathtaking book comes from Australian artist and illustrator Elise Hurst, who also happens to be the illustrator of a book I plan to cover later this fall, Trying by Kobe Yamada. An incredibly meaningful book with beautiful illustration. But this particular book is something I have never seen before. I'm not sure if it has been made by someone somewhere along the line. I certainly have never heard of it, other than the excellent foreword by Neil Gaiman. And yes, Neil is here again. Neil, do you ever take a day off? And this wonderful invitation from Hurst, and the occasional page with a few inspirational words to spur you forward. There are no words in this book, and there is no narrative sequence of events given in the illustrations. What you have here is a source book, a set of unique, completely disparate visuals that are not meant to tell the story. You are. Maybe you want to take your pet wombat out for a walk. Perhaps you want to survey the situation before jumping in. You might not even be sure what to call a thing, so you have to start describing it first. All that we know for sure is that starting with this book as your inspiration, you're gonna create a masterpiece. I have never seen something like this. Detailed illustrations that are jumping off points for the narratives that you want to build. It doesn't matter if you want to tell the story verbally, or you want to start writing something down. The Storyteller's Handbook is full of magical realism and a bit of chaos. There are, in fact, 52 different illustrations, so theoretically, if you did this once a week, you would have a whole year of stories. Most of them portray an otherworldly perspective on the world we somewhat recognize, while others might be slightly farther flung. I've had a chance to think a lot about this book in the last few months since I got it, and I'm so surprised that I had never thought to do this with all the images that I have collected in my life. Why have I not gone through my phone and looked for those things that I have taken pictures of to inspire me and written a little narrative? Or what other story that I already loved does this remind me of? Is there a way I could spin some other story that exists in this way? It's my opinion that this book, other than what it does within itself, I think that it's also spawned a new genre. What if we had other illustrators make their own source books for storytelling, their own compendiums of jump-off points with no explanation and no definition? I could easily see a general bookstore stocking a whole shelf of these, especially if they came from people with widely varying visual styles. But I also think perhaps we need to view our other art sources as source books for narrative. I'm sure that other people have thought of doing this. I have thought about doing it on rare occasion when spurred by a particular piece. Until this book, it had never occurred to me to do that as a practice. I not only collect all sorts of art books, I'm an avid museum goer, and I take a lot of photos when I'm in museums. I've been trying to find some things to do with them, like put together my own photo books, but I also think it could be really, really interesting to use them as narrative jump-off points. What Hurst has done here is flippin' brilliant. I really think you need to go out and get this book right now. Whether you want to start telling stories, whether you already tell them, whether you have a loved one who loves to tell stories. And frankly, for those among us who simply love spectacular illustration, I have rarely seen anything quite this spectacular. There's definitely some shades of Chris Van Alsberg here. You will probably remember Van Alsberg's illustrations from The Polar Express and Jumanji and a bunch of other books. But I'm also seeing something that reminds me of Graham Base. His most recognizable book would probably be Animalia. But in the end, in style and in content for each piece, Hurst is doing something unique that is truly only coming out of her imagination. It compiles so many different references, animals, humans. It is truly a masterwork. And Ms. Hurst, I really hope you do more of these. Could you please do a whole library of them? I will buy them all. Of course, we all love reading stories, otherwise we wouldn't be watching this channel, and I probably wouldn't be making it. But honestly, taking on the art of storytelling, even if your practice is completely private and completely casual, it is a marvelous way to expand your horizons. One could even argue that it's a way to ensure that our picture always gets bigger. As I have mentioned recently, I happen to be Jewish. I, in fact, come from a mixed background. So you're going to get stuff from a couple of different faith traditions that I have been very close to, and probably some stuff from faith traditions that I have not. Today, we're going to talk about some great Jewish books. I've decided this is only volume 1 because there are some other great books that I hope to profile in the spring. The Jewish High Holy Days start in earnest next week, although there has been some prep time for those of you keeping score, and that's why I thought this would be a great time to launch into some of these titles. First book is called Osnat and Her Dove, the true story of the world's first female rabbi. It's written by Sigal Samuel and illustrated by Vali Mintzi. So this story took place in what would now be considered modern-day Iraq. She was born in the late 1500s and lived through about the mid-1600s. Her father ran the yeshiva, i.e. the religious school, in the city of Mosul. And in this particular time and place, women were not taught a lot about the Torah or the other traditional texts of Judaism. But Osnat here, pictured with a bunch of beautiful Hebrew letters, I might add, was so passionate about studying the Torah that her father not only allowed her but encouraged encouraged her to keep going. When the time came for Osnat to get married, she refused to marry any man who would not allow her to continue focus on Torah study. And her father agreed. They finally found the right guy, and when her father passed away, her husband took over the yeshiva. Her husband, while a great guy, was much more interested in studying the Torah for himself than teaching the students, and so guess who started teaching everybody else? When her husband finally passed away, she struggled with whether or not she should take over the yeshiva, but her father came to her in a dream and said, "Yeah, kid, it's definitely your job." She had a pet dove that had befriended her along the way, and right after she takes over the yeshiva, a hunter accidentally shoots and kills it. And after she takes him inside and the crowd outside waits for a while, suddenly, there's the dove, perfectly healed. People began coming to her for healing from all over the place. And she and her dove were known to work more than one more miracle after that. This is a glorious book. The illustrations were the first thing to pull me in because, just look at it. I saw someone talk about her illustrations as some sort of mix between Gauguin and Matisse. I couldn't agree more, but it also has such a unique spin, a color theory all her own. I'm very, very impressed. But this story in its own right is powerful and it's very skillfully told. It's an incredible story that also helps a lot of people rethink the place of women in the traditions of Judaism, not just the present. Highly, highly recommend this one. Next, we have The World Needs Beautiful Things, written by Leah Rachelle Berkowitz and illustrated by Daniele Fabbri. So in the Torah, it talks about the Jewish people, at the time known as the Israelites, enslaved in ancient Egypt, how Moses became their deliverer via God's help. As they wandered the desert for 40 years, they built something called the Mishkan. In English, the tabernacle. This is something that God commands them to build. In essence, it is a portable temple. The presence of God moves with the people. They do not have to go to a stationary point. That happens much later in Jewish history. The Torah tells us that the architect of the Mishkan was someone named Bezalel. And this book imagines Bezalel as a child, experiencing all of those phases of the Exodus story that I just mentioned. It starts with the people in slavery, when Bezalel starts collecting beautiful things to keep in a box that he simply calls his box of beautiful things. His fellow Israelite slaves are a little bit chagrined that he would stop work to do this, but he simply says, the world needs beautiful things. The same thing happens when the people are delivered from the land of Egypt. They gotta get up and go at a moment's notice, and they can only take what they can carry on their backs. Bezalel, of course, takes his box of beautiful things. His parents beg him not to, but he says the same thing, the world needs beautiful things. Eventually, in this particular version, Moses says, God wants us to build this thing, and he said we need to start with string. Anybody got any string? And Bezalel says, what color do you want? I got them all. And that is when Moses puts him in charge of building the Mishkan. In Judaism, there's a tradition called Midrash. Not to be too reductive about it, but one very simple way to put it is, people have written stories across Jewish history, many of which that have become embedded in the tradition, that take their inspiration from a moment or a character in the biblical text, sometimes even a word in the text, and then they build a whole new narrative off of it to bring new meaning. Far later in the Jewish tradition, someone known for really big ideas said, imagination is more important than knowledge. And I think this book backs Einstein up on that one. It was only through childlike wonder, and in this case the appreciation of the beautiful, that the great artisan Bezalel was able to make something so spectacular. Maybe we ought to take a page from that. Next, we have an all too rare picture book from my favorite Jewish holiday. Sukkot comes at the end of the high holiday season. This year, I believe it's mid to late October. It is a celebration of God's provision for the children of Israel in the desert for those 40 years. And it's also a time of harvest and celebration. So if you have a balcony, a flat roof, or some kind of a yard, you build a temporary shelter. It's gotta be flimsy. It's gotta have a roof made out of foliage that allows you to still see the stars. Because these are not houses that can really shelter you from much. In that particular tradition, God is the sustainer, not anything we can build. And once the thing is built, you get to hang out in it for about a week, and you can visit your friends' sukkahs. It's great. Everybody just hangs out. You get to eat in the sukkah. It's a good time. Anyhow, unless you happen to be an Orthodox Jew, Sukkot was not particularly well practiced until a few years ago, and I'm very happy to say it has experienced a massive resurgence in all other branches of Judaism. So we're starting to see more things like this. The Elephant in the Sukkah, written by Sherri Mandell and illustrated by Ivana Kuman. The story starts with Henry, a circus elephant who loves to sing. That's his job, and he's really great at it. But like all of us, Henry got old, and unfortunately was unceremoniously replaced. So he basically heads off to the elephant retirement farm, and everybody is tired and sad, and nobody wants to sing, and they don't really like it when he sings. Henry's not having a very good time. One day he hears singing down the road, and so he follows it. And he happens across the Brenner family celebrating out in their sukkah. I've had some amazing jam sessions in the sukkah, by the way. It is an ideal place for that. In Henry's case, he listens in, he doesn't know the words, but he learns the tune, and he hums the songs as he heads home. The next night he heads back over and starts singing along. He hasn't had anybody to sing with in so long. And little Ori sees him and says, hey, you want to come inside? It's important to understand that it's considered a mitzvah, i.e. a fulfillment of a commandment, to set foot inside the sukkah. Unfortunately for Henry, one could say it is not size inclusive. So the Brenners do the next best thing and move one of the walls and help Henry become one of the sides of the sukkah. The next year they make it nice and big, and they've got a whole group of new friends who are also finally ready to sing. I love this book. It isn't a bad introduction to some of the basics about Sukkot, and I also love that it's a very inclusive message. They don't ask him who he is. Is he a Jewish elephant? We don't know. He is simply invited in. One of the other mitzvot related to Sukkot happens to be having visitors come into the sukkah. It's considered a great honor for people to stop by your sukkah and even to stay there overnight. So they have included Henry, and in return, whether he knew it or not, he has done them a great honor. Isn't that cool? And finally, we come to probably the best known of any of these books, Gershon's Monster. It is a Jewish folktale retold by Eric A Kimmel and illustrated by John J. Muth. Muth has an amazing series of books around the concept of Zen, and Kimmel is known for doing these retellings of Jewish folktales. This happens to be a Rosh Hashanah themed book, because after the morning prayers that usually happen in the synagogue for the holiday, people go out to a moving body of water. That would have to be something like a river or the ocean or a large lake. I did once see people using a fountain. You gotta do what you gotta do. You either take small pieces of bread, almost like you're gonna feed ducks or something, or you take rocks. I have actually done both. And when you get there, you carefully toss them into the water as a way of repenting from your sins. It is one of my absolutely favorite traditions within religious Judaism, and something that I have found incredible renewal through over and over again. So to have a book on that particular subject is pretty great. Gershon and his wife Fega live in this little town by the Black Sea. Gershon was not very good at apologizing or telling people that he'd messed up. So instead of owning up to his mistakes, he always swept things under the rug, as it were. Although in his case, it means he swept all of his little sins into the basement. Once a year, he would pack all of these things that had accumulated into a huge bag, and he would take them to the nearby sea and toss them all in. Still not a bit of repentance in sight. He and his wife really want to have children and can't seem to have one. And in order to figure out the problem, Fega suggests that Gershon go see the local tzaddik. Tzaddik literally means the righteous one, and it tends to refer to a holy person who has a lot in the know. So when he goes to see the tzaddik says, I can help you with that, but you don't want that. Gershon says, of course I want that. I want children. The tzaddik says, no, because they're only going to live to be about 5 years old. And I can't tell you what's going to happen, but it would be better if you just didn't have them. But Gershon insists, and the tzaddik acquiesces. Sure enough, a year later, Fega gives birth to twins, a girl and a boy. As they grow up, every day they love to play by the sea. The Meshuggah Gershon continues his idiocy, his utter recklessness, and suddenly one day he remembers the tzaddik gave him a sign. When you accidentally put both socks on the same foot one morning and continue to look for the missing sock, that's the day you're gonna lose your kids. Gershon races down to the shore, just in time to see a monster rising out of the waves, comprised completely of his sins like scales. Only then does Gershon repent of all of his wrongdoing. He says, it's all my fault, I'm sorry, take me instead. And guess what? Repentance works. And thank God the catastrophe was averted and the family lived very happily ever after. Whether or not you're Jewish or belong to any religious tradition, I think that this concept of repentance is still a very, very important one for all of us to grasp. In Hebrew, the word for repentance is tshuva, to turn around. Everybody is going to do stuff wrong. Everybody has to learn to own it, ask for forgiveness, and truly move on from what they've done. It's actually pretty common that we repeat the same things over and over and over again, inflicting the same harm on others and on ourselves. This book is an amazing reminder of the power of turning around. We need to start fresh in a whole new direction, and sincere apology is a really important place to start. Leshana tova, mishpucha. Happy New Year, friends. May it be a sweet new year, and I say this to all my Jewish and non-Jewish friends. May your name be written, and may it be sealed in the book of life. The picture is always bigger. Walk with me, New York, the beauty of New York City through the lens of Susan Kaufman. I love New York. After 42 years of life, I have not yet found another place in this world in which I feel so at home. Even though I'm a born and raised West Coaster, and in fact am still out here. I was finally fortunate enough to visit again this past May after many years of absence, but when I can't get there in person, books are definitely one of my favorite ways to visit the city. And this particular book is spectacular in a wonderfully quiet way. Kaufman is the founder of People Style Watch magazine, a former fashion editor at Condé Nast, and a longtime professional photographer. She and her husband split their time between two homes, one next to East Hampton and the other in Greenwich Village, and I think her love for the city is palpable in every single photograph. You're not going to see the trash on the sidewalks, or the rampant tagging, or even many people in these particular pages. Generally, I love the roughness of New York just as much as I love anything polished about it. But there is something to the relative stillness of this collection. Shot primarily in Manhattan, Manhattan with a brief foray into Brooklyn, particularly for people who only associate Manhattan with massive crowds and a super fast pace of life. This collection provides a counterpoint that is easy to find if one takes the right streets. One of the favorite walks I took on my trip last spring was through Soho, a neighborhood I had somehow never been to before, and I was so excited to see whether or not Kaufman had caught the same things I caught with my camera. And when it came to storefronts, it turned out she did. I love The Little Prince, and this florist's arbor is absolutely breathtaking. She spends a lot of time on both the East and West Village, my dream neighborhoods. As a creative polyglot, I always thought that maybe I was born for the Village. And Kaufman does not disappoint. She spends a lot of this book exploring it. She also spent some time in NoHo and Nolita, Gramercy Park, Carnegie Hill, and the Upper East Side, briefly heading into Brooklyn Heights. A well-inspired interactive touch that Kaufman included in this book, these hand-drawn neighborhood maps detailing her favorite streets to walk, it really does help you feel that you've been taken along, and it does give you a way to go find these places yourself. Kaufman also quite handily shares the variegated grandeur of New York through the various seasons. Summer is a little harder for an outsider to spot, but the other 3 seasons as depicted here are obvious and lovely. Spring, autumn, and winter. This book gives New York City the kind of photographic treatment often reserved for Paris, a city known for its incredibly thoughtful and pervasive creativity. Although I could spend years of my life in Paris quite happily, even on a short excursion, it is clear Paris possesses a commonality of uncommon beauty. But New York possesses a much larger portion of this uncommon beauty than most people might realize on first glance. A certain genteel, often even precious face she hides behind the grit and the sweat, the seemingly endless blocks of imposing skyscrapers, and the crowds upon crowds of commuters and tourists. Again, I love all of it. But there are times when you just want the lady to drop the grand marquees and the digital billboards larger than your house and settle into some deeper, softer breathing. There is one difficult thing about this project that I think it's important to mention. From what I can tell, except for the public parks, every place photographed in this book is a place of extraordinary privilege. The Village, way past her bohemian artist glory days, when all sorts of people piled in for prices they could afford, and made great things together. After my trip, I looked into moving into Soho. You don't even want to know. And several of the neighborhoods depicted here border Park Avenue, which have always been places flowing with a lot of money. As I mentioned in our recent discussion about how to read an image, photographers frame what they see in the world the way that any artist frames their art. In sharing a composition with you, a photographer is showing you not just what they want you to see, but how they want you to see it. Kaufman has presented us here with a fantasy version of New York, an exquisite edit that, yes, focuses on spaces inhabited by wealthy people. Although I would like to be clear, and I love that she does this, she has no interest in focusing on the over-the-top opulent. For me, I am happy to enjoy that fantasy in one hand, while also grasping firmly in the other. The average New Yorker's constant struggle to stay in the city, much less try to thrive there, does intend to look a lot like this New York. I don't think that the answer is that nobody should live in these beautiful homes. I think that things like this can also serve as an inspiration to build a future where we all get to live in beautiful homes, where everything is affordable, where we can shop in beautiful places and have a beautiful lunch in a beautiful restaurant. Fantasy can reinforce hierarchy of status, or it can inspire us to picture more for each other. Great wages and wonderful housing and access to nature for all. I challenge you, no matter what your fantasy, use the fantasy you love to make the picture bigger. It's the first day of fall, guys. And it's also my mom's birthday. Happy birthday, Mom. Guess what? I got you a book. So to celebrate the new season, today we're going to look at The Leaf Thief, written by Alice Hemming and illustrated by Nicola Slater. A quick side note about the way this book is made. I have this thing where I don't understand why we need dust jackets anymore. I do tend to keep the dust jackets on all of my picture books at least, because often the thing underneath is different from what's on that dust jacket. That's changing a bit, but I still find it annoying that everything needs a dust jacket. This one did not have to have a dust jacket, and look, they put this amazing copper leaf on the actual book. I think it's rad, I think it saves resources, and I think you should do this more often, publishing business. Ooh. So in this story, a squirrel is simply enjoying the amazing canopy of fall leaves he has in his beloved tree, when all of a sudden he realizes, wait a minute, why is there a leaf missing? Why? So he frantically calls his neighbor, Bird, someone stole my leaf! By the way, I really appreciate, as a child who grew up in bowling leagues, that Bird is learning how to bowl. It's like, That's pretty great. Anyhow, they end up on a brief series of misadventures over the next couple of days, in which the squirrel keeps seeing other animals with leaves in various places, assumes they're his, makes minor accusations, and it doesn't turn out to be correct. Bird keeps trying to get through to him, but the squirrel is not quite getting it. I mean, the woodpecker's leaves don't even look like the squirrel's leaves. And dear Bird keeps reminding him, you do remember this happened last year, right? He just tries to go home and not think about it too much. And the next day, when even more leaves are missing, the squirrel's like, wait, Bird, are you the thief? The bird, understandably, has finally had it. In fact, I think the bird has been rather long-suffering, to be honest, and hauls the squirrel up to the top of the tree, where the squirrel learns the wind is the real leaf thief. It shakes everything loose and takes it away. Oh, that's right. The leaves change, and then the wind comes along, and oh, that's all it is. How nice. Until the next day, Bird, someone has stolen the grass. I mean, yes, not only is this story super simple, it is silly. It is very silly. There's an interesting message, especially for adults in this book. It's incredibly silly not to acknowledge natural processes. The seasons happen, things are born, they have their prime, and then they die, and then things renew. Aging is probably the best corollary for this. We act like it's not really happening, we try to make sure it doesn't happen until we can no longer avoid it. And then if we're not really in tune with it, we panic. And not only do we panic, sometimes we miss out on some really, really pretty leaves, so to speak. So our short little thought for the first day of fall: enjoy the natural process of things. Try to keep in tune with it and not be afraid of it, the changing of the leaves and the winter after it. The picture is always bigger. Don't be the squirrel, be the bird, and also go bowling. Welcome to Theory Friday, gang. Yes, Friday, not Wednesday. Trying it out, gonna see how I like the different flow of the week. Today's entirely subjective topic is, what do I look for in illustration? I suppose there's a little bit of an aspect of get to know me in this topic, but I'm primarily doing this to start a conversation about how we all do this. When you see a picture on the front of a book, or you open a picture book, what is it that attracts your attention? Do different things attract your attention? If you're trying to expand your horizons, where can you expand them? So yes, you're about to be subjected to an entire cavalcade of books, none of which are going to be talked about in depth, but I have included the basic information for all of these books in the caption of this video. All right, let's go. Visually speaking, I tend to have pretty broad taste. A lot of adult collectors tend to emphasize detail in illustration as its own good. I, on the other hand, do not. That is not to say that I dislike detail. There are certain times and places when I absolutely love it, like this one. It's hard not to appreciate the technique that goes into something like this, in colored pencil no less. But more often than not, I tend to prefer slightly less refined, possibly sketchier styles. This is my current top "why is this not published in the States yet" book, and illustrators with an incredible mastery of simple form really speak to me. I also love to collect books whose visual style clearly comes from different cultures, ethnic identities, and national groups. The author-illustrator of this book is Nigerian and Italian. This is the work of an Indian-American illustrator we're going to look at pretty soon. And this one comes from a Chilean artist, illustrating one of Mexico's greatest poets, Pablo Neruda. Meanwhile, there are some things that turn me off from a book on site. Probably the biggest one, I don't like things that are cutesy. I would juxtapose two different terms, cutesy versus adorable. We all like things that are cute at times. Okay, most of us. But to me, cutesy kind of implies a thoughtless simpering, a sort of pandering to the viewer, like, I know you like cute things, don't you? It's like, oh gosh. Publishers are publishing a ton of cutesy books, as any children's bookseller can tell you, and it's really not that fun. However, there are things that I do love that I would consider adorable. It's probably just a slightly deeper, more thoughtful version of cute. The illustrations are better. They don't look like every other cutesy book on the block. Most kids booksellers I know are big fans of Jessie Sima precisely because she does that incredibly well. And one of my favorites from my childhood, Sandra Boynton, never, ever, ever, ever disappoints. Her calendar is on the wall right outside this room. Her brand of adorable, I'm in. I also don't like things that seem to be clawing their way into the current trends. If a book looks like everybody else's, I'm just not interested. It doesn't mean that trends are bad. Trends are always a normal part of visual culture. If you're involved in images made by people around other people, there's gonna be trends. It's just a matter of don't try to make sure it looks like the trend, or maybe try to innovate on something that you saw. We're gonna take another look at some of that stuff later that I think does that skillfully. But yeah, if you just look like everything else on the display, no thank you. And the last thing that sometimes turns me off, there's a lot of illustration that would have been much better if it had remained rough rather than being made into a polished final version. I'm not gonna name names, but there are certain illustrators who I follow online that go, oh my gosh, I love your work. And then I see their books illustrated and they've cleaned it up and it's just meh. But again, that's my taste, so what do I know? You do you. Preparing this video was a little bit rough because I'm backtracking to try to figure out how my gut instincts work. Sometimes I can't explain why I like this book and don't like this book. Most of the time, if I think about it enough, I can figure it out. So the rest of this video is going to be spent primarily looking at things that hit that gut instinct of mine on a display or when I'm browsing and I go, that thing, instantly I like that. And here's why. We're immediately going to talk about that whole business about being trendy. When you're talking about trends, one of the interesting aspects is a lot of the people I'm going to show you in later categories in this video were once the height of the trend, or they were ahead of the trend, and now everybody's trying to be them. But I'm going to tell you, there are certain people that either set trends or are ahead of trends. Sometimes are just the best at a trend in the middle of its life. Visually, these are 3 books that hit that for me. Carl James Mountford is a Welsh illustrator whose first author book is coming out soon. I can't wait. Who I discovered years ago on Society 6. More of his illustrations at the time were in products rather than in books. I'm happy to say that in the UK, he's enjoying an incredibly good career so far. And I hope he enjoys that soon enough here too. I've seen a lot of people adopt this style since, but he was one of the first to do it, and I still think he's one of the best at it. And then there's Flavia Drago, who we recently looked at. You know, I'm a big fan. A lot of people are trying to do work that looks a lot like this. They just don't do it as well. It's not as tight. It's not as well informed by a tradition, which I think in this case makes a lot of the difference. Her work is just that great. And this advanced copy just arrived in the mail for me from my friend Allie Bryden. Look, Allie, look what arrived! I love it. Aisling Lindsay is using some techniques that I'm used to seeing, certain ways of using pastels as color blocking, but she's also adding in some line work that I don't usually see with that technique. I feel she's elevating certain trends in illustration right here. Allie and I plan to sit down and talk about this book on this channel, so stay tuned later this fall. You're going to hear a lot more about it. Speaking of people who set trends that everybody else tries to copy after them, John Klassen. Klassen is one of my favorites of all time. I love Klassen because he is uniquely gifted at visual irony and is a master of understatement. Some of the funniest books you will ever read are either by Klassen or by Klassen with Mac Barnett. As soon as I'm done shooting this video, I'm actually going out to order their latest, The Three Billy Goats Gruff. Stay tuned on that one too. And if we're going to talk about deadpan understatement, we can't leave out Edward Gorey. I have always wanted to receive a doubtful guest. I'm also a pretty big fan of absurdism in most areas of my life. These illustrations by Aaron Rainier are just perfect nonsense absurdism. But while visual absurdism tends to be used for sillier projects these days, and Lord knows sometimes I do just love something silly. Sometimes, as in the case of this book about refugees, it can be used for very serious purposes. An excellent book. Again, as an animation nerd, I have a special love for books either created by animators or who possess an animator's touch when it comes to character design and flow of movement. Ida Caban, big on my list for this one. And of course, our dear Benson Schum, the incomparable Chris Van Dusen, and Steph Liberis, who happened to illustrate my favorite ABC book in recent years. And the great comic artist Patrick McDonnell also has a lot of these qualities I look for. Look at all of the emotion he gets out of the body language of his characters. That's what I'm talking about. There are other times when a book is just so stunningly beautiful that I have to take a look at it. From earlier this week, Elise Hurst's Storytelling Handbook is definitely in this category. Bozick's illustrations in the book Trees. Graham Baker Smith gave us one of the most beautiful covers I have ever seen. Denos Star-Crossed, a magical book with otherworldly illustration. And literally anything illustrated by Kay Nielsen. And this is another book we're going to look at later this year. When it comes to children's storybooks, I do still love a lot of the classics. And there are certain illustrators that I view as absolutely iconic. Sendak, Ray, Eastman, Ungerer, Keats, and of course, the Good Doctor. We're going to be talking about him next week. I also have a particular love of illustration that reminds me of things I've seen before, but also somehow does something new. As an illustration collector, it's probably one of the bigger thrills I get. I snapped this book up on site because it reminded me so strongly of 1950s techniques, which were both highly color blocked yet had to use very few colors because of printing processes. And while using a few more colors in its overall color scheme, the very shape-driven with texture inside thing that I love from a lot of 50s illustration is very much maintained. This one was not a big hit, and I was super bummed out about that because it's about a dodo in contemporary life who loves donuts. Come on! This is another one we're going to look at later because it's one of my favorite read-alouds from last year, possibly one of my favorite read-alouds ever. And Dina Sieverling's illustrations really call back to almost a Robert McCluskey kind of thing. Remember Make Way for Ducklings? Kind of has a little bit of that classicism, but takes it in a whole other direction that I just can't get enough of. Some of my favorite illustrators, and the two I'm about to talk about are both on my ones to watch list, remind me of specific, well-beloved classic illustrators. Do not misunderstand me because I'm not saying that they are copying anybody's work. I'm not even sure in one case if they're influenced by this other work. First time I saw Gracie Shang's excellent Lala's words, it reminded me so strongly of certain aspects of Bemelman's work. Bemelman's is the guy behind Madeline, which as you know is hands down one of my favorite classics. There are certain senses of line and composition that I feel relate very strongly, but Shang is so distinct that she just blows me away. We're going to be talking a lot about her in the future, and I don't think just on this channel. And the great Sir Quentin Blake, who most people remember as Roald Dahl's standing illustrator, and for good reason, although he has illustrated a ton of other people's work and done some remarkable work all on his own. When I first saw this book illustrated by my buddy Ian Morris, who thankfully became my buddy because of my love of this particular book, the first thing out of my mouth was, oh my god, it's Blake. But it has an entirely unique color theory that looks nothing like Blake. But oh my gosh, he's taking it in so many different directions. We're about to have a serious Ian Morris fest on this channel because he's got something new coming out, and he's my first interview. Stay tuned this October. Ian, can't wait to talk to you. And then there are times when somebody does something that I simply haven't seen before. This is also one of the bigger thrills I get. Like the great Chris Riddell's Made Up Timorous Beasts, or Jessica Love's unusual use of craft paper, a technique that specifically helps darker skin tones pop off the page and glow in really unique ways. Sometimes respected illustrators go out on a limb and do something no one's ever seen them do before, or anybody do before, in Mo Willems' case. Go look this one up, it's wild. And the same goes for the Fan Brothers Barnabas project. Nothing quite like it in the world. I mean, nothing. And then you have work like Hina Bake's work in Moon Pops, using cutouts, photography, and light sources to create illustrations like I've never seen. Some people, like Portuguese illustrator Andre Letria, simply possess an unparalleled ability to create visual metaphor. And sometimes there's just something so brand new, like this book by Logan S. Klein that just dropped a couple of weeks ago, that I can't quite quantify what's so new about it for me. I just bask in it. Go find this one. My boyfriend and I both cried. And then, of course, and I know this is going to come as a shock to all of you, there's definitely one more thing that always gets me anytime I see it on display. Color! 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 So much color. Have I mentioned color? Color. And finally, color! I mean, they don't all have to have color, but let's face it, most of my picks have a decent amount of color. So that's a little... That's how I look for illustration, and that process changes across time, and there's parts of my gut instinct that I can't explain. So how do you look for illustration? What is it that you like? Are there books from your childhood that trigger warm memories as soon as you see them? Are there things you wouldn't have picked up 5 years ago that now you go, oh yeah, I definitely want that thing? Take some time to think about it. And the next time you're in a bookstore, take a little time and see what you automatically gravitate to. Open up a few books and see if it holds as you walk through the illustrations. And yeah, especially if you're in an indie bookstore, you could buy like 5, 6, 7, 12, 13 of those. That'd be great. I mean, much like my bookshelf, the picture is always bigger. Bonus fun fact about my family. We have this term book slide because there were so many books in my house, and when I was a kid they were stacked up so high even on top of the bookshelves that every once in a while from whatever room in the house you would hear a crashing sound that sounded like a bunch of books, and 95% probably was a bunch of books. Are you okay? Yep, just a book slide. Book slide. Nothing to be concerned about. Why on earth did I think to tell you about that today? No idea whatsoever. Book slide.